Hey everyone, today I'm joined again by Patrick Barry, continuing our conversation from last time. Patrick is a former science journalist and currently works as a coder on the Waking Up app. And I wanted to continue our conversation. I feel like we just got things kind of kicked off and started, but there's so many fascinating avenues I'd like to explore. So before we do that, though, thanks, Patrick. Really appreciate you coming back on to continue the conversation.
Yeah, great to be on again.
Lovely. So yeah, I think a lot of our convergence, kind of conceptually on this, which is what really excites me about our conversations and what you're kind of bringing into the conversation space is this idea of like secular spirituality. And we talked a little bit last time about how kind of the spiritual space, the spiritual discourse can tend to veer very easily into woo, into sort of ungrounded claims and uh, kind of propositions about reality. And I think that one of the things that really unites our approach and our interest is trying to reground or reframe like a spirituality or a secular spirituality framework in which we're drawing on just the natural sciences and a kind of what Greg Enriquez calls an endo-naturalistic framework that's still deeply meaningful and significant and profound and sublime, in the sense that the religious traditions used to foster that sense of awe and reverence. So, and maybe just picking up there and then kind of going in any number of directions. Say a little bit more about that, how you conceive of that, because I felt like we touched on it last time, but I feel like it's there's a lot to be said there in terms of linking the spiritual with the natural, right? A lot of people feel like these are sort of diametrically opposed. There's the natural world and the supernatural world. There's science and then there's religion. How do you think of these things in a way that's not sort of dualistically opposed, but somehow integrated?
Yeah. I mean, this raises the problem of definitions a little bit, and not to get too pedantic, but like when you say spirituals, different people have different ideas of what you're even talking about with that. Like some people will see it in contrast to any kind of naturalistic framework because they take it as by definition dealing with things that are beyond that, right? So, I mean, we get into a terminology problem of not having good words to describe this, so we fall back on things like spiritual. But in short, like to me, if you drop kind of all of your need to reach certain conclusions, if you kind of drop any preconceived notions and just, like if you suddenly had some sort of, or if we all had some sort of collective amnesia all of a sudden about all of these kind of things that we inherit from our culture about ideas around spirituality and what that includes and what it doesn't include, um, what would reemerge in time just because of how the world is, right? Like, what is sort of the inescapable, inevitable, call it spirituality of existence? Or is there any? Even dropping the notion that you need to come to that conclusion. And part of why I feel compelled by all this is as someone with a science background, I kind of dispensed with religion at one point and didn't feel any got very humble in the face of evidence and was very much about what we can say with any kind of confidence. And what I have found from in my own experience of going down that road far enough and learning enough about that and getting past the biology 101 version of things and trying to really gain a sense of what is the reality that the fullest descriptions of science available is trying to describe, as yet incompletely. Um, to me, that just when you get close to a sense of that, it's just inescapably wow, or something. There's some kind
Hmm.
of awe, some kind of rapture, some kind of deeply moving side to that, especially when you don't keep it over there at arm's distance, but recognize you are not separate from any of this. Um, and so it's not necessarily that I want to come to that conclusion or that I need to, or that I'm finding a way to work backwards towards some kind of a call it spiritual conclusion, but I don't know what else to call it when, the world is just that
Yeah.
amazing, cool and mind blowing and, Yeah.
Question. Yeah, so there's sort of two elements, at least, obviously, that kind of come up here. One is that what you're naming is the sort of awe, the sort of wow, the sublimity, the profundity feeling, all that.
Hmm.
Um, but related to that as well is the sense of mystery, I think. And these are deeply related, but I feel like in many ways the whole crux of the religion versus science thing seems to, you know, it seems to converge on this point, because there's a degree to which I think when a lot of people talk about spirituality, they're referring to something that supposedly is like beyond the realm of our understanding. It's an unknown, it's a mystery. It's like
Mm.
it's precisely the space at which science no longer explains things that people say, ah, and then they want to posit some divine force that caused it, or they want to posit some deep, mysterious entity or profound, whatever to it. And so that, though, I think is there's a hinge point there for some of this conflict because there's a degree to which science, right, is it's explaining things about reality. It's giving us causes and answers to how things work. And in some sense, you could see that as taking mystery out of the world. Um, and so I don't know. At the same time, though, I've come to view this rather differently because I used to feel that very much in the form of kind of a disenchantment, right? It's sort of like
Mm.
once you know how the magic trick works, it's no longer magic, and once how I don't know, let's say natural evolution works, and there's no kind of hand of God, blah blah blah. So there's a sort of immediate reaction of like, oh, now that it's explained, it's no longer wow, right? But that's not
Hmm.
quite right because I feel like one, the descriptive mechanisms that are shaping and guiding reality as we know it are still mind-bogglingly amazing once you become aware of them, which science has actually even opened up more. But two, I feel like there's always going to be continued mystery and uncertainty and unanswered questions in even the scientific paradigm that we're still asking questions about. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about the sacred and the spiritual sensibility as relating to this awe and the wow factor and the profundity aspect and how that relates to mystery and how science and religion kind of speak to those things differently. Big question.
Yeah, a few things. I mean, for one, it's interesting to note that people sort of have some desire for things to be mysterious, that you want things to be that way, which is an
Mm.
interesting thing just to be self-aware about. You're insisting for the world to be a certain way, which is a pretty you know, um
It's not a
uh,
scout mindset.
it's not a scout mindset for sure. But also, even so, just to put some, I think that the continued existence is not in danger here, on a few levels. For one, whatever scientific description we have of the world right now is definitely incomplete. So, even the scientists at the edge of human knowledge are keenly aware of the deepness and profundity of the remaining mystery. So no worries there. But even within like what is known, well known and well described, everything ultimately rests on a foundation of, it's all castles in the sky, right? Like, um, everything can be, even if you take a reductionist stance, you can only reduce so far. Like it becomes turtles all the way down. And at some point, Richard Feynman made a really good explanation of this, where you just have to take some things as given. Because if you insist on always explaining something in terms of something else, particularly when it comes to like particle physics and fundamental physics, you can't just keep asking, well, then what's that made of, and what's that made of, and it's at some point it's quarks. Well, what are quarks made of? Like, what's the electromagnetic force? What is that made of? Like, you have to. That becomes infinite regress if you're not willing to, and theoretical physicists who deal with this, like, just know that, like, at some point there's just an axiom of like, well, these four things exist, and based on that,
Hmm.
we can explain everything else without reference to other things, within the range of their experiments and the things they're trying to describe. And so, you know, looking at it that way, at bottom, it just is what it is,
Hmm.
and in a way that you just have to stop trying to explain it at some point. It just is the thing that has these forces and these kinds of particles, and is what all of space and time, the dimensions of space and time themselves are interwoven with this. Like it's just all of existence and creation in this sort of, the 14 billion year old thing, or however long old it actually is. Like the the suchness of it, the isness of
Mm.
it is at bottom mysterious. Ultimately,
Mm.
call it energy, call it, I don't know, whatever it is.
Do you, so my kind of background from sort of evangelical Christianity starts to ring in my ears here because I was into apologetics for a period of time, which is all about trying to kind of rationalize faith and bring faith into discourse with rational argumentation and evidence and everything. Um, and a lot of the language that kind of comes out of that is sort of like trying to bring in a sense of faith, quote unquote, into back into the discussion, and some folks do that kind of by essentially, I think, naming what you just described as an act of faith. And I wanted to get your feelings on that idea. Like if there is just the sense that fundamentally there it doesn't all bottom out somewhere, but there is just sort of a need to accept certain things as axiomatic givens, like a positing or an affirmation, or you could even see like a creedal statement about we start here. Do you find any meaningful or valuable connection to doing that with sort of the notion of sort of adopting just a faith in reality such as it is, or is it more confusing to use that language?
I'm not sure it helps from my point of view, and I think it's bound to confuse it with
Mm.
bringing in other kind of psychological concepts that involves. I mean, I think from the point of view of the task of living a human life, some amount of faith becomes inevitable because not even physicists can't know everything, and we have to move forward anyway. Like as an inescapable aspect of living a human life with a finite brain and finite time and all of that, then without being in a state of constant anxiety and fear and cowering in the face of the vastness of what's in front of you, yeah, you kind of need some ability just to say fuck it and move forward. Call that faith, right? But I don't know. I'm not a theologian. I'm not like that side of things. I might be even misunderstanding what people mean by that. But
Well, I like a faith defined as fuck it, let's move forward. That's a nice
I
sort of
mean,
like there's a kind of metamodern quality to that as well. There's this notion of sort of pragmatic idealism or naive informed naivete, the sense of like, yes, we know that we don't know, but we have to just act. We have to keep moving. We have to keep living. There's a pragmatic necessity to life as well. And in order to escape from sort of the infinite regression of just sort of endless skepticism, endless sort of critiquing and looking to tear things apart more and more, reduce them more and more. There does need to be a place where you just posit a ground and work from there. But that does seem to be a different ground for different people. And one of the challenges then is like, how do we have a justified true belief, let's say, or some justified reason for positing that ground where we do? Because some people will want to just posit at God. They'll just say, look, I take that whole thing to just say, yes, look at reality, look how profound it is. Therefore, we posit a God, and therefore we live as if there is a God, and then we connect to that God and all that. Whereas other people will say something different. I don't know if there's enough of if you have any thoughts on that, and yeah, just
um, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, I don't know what I would say to that exactly. Again, God is one of those words that people take to mean different things,
right.
right? And so, um, and it is sort of a leap, and if we understand these things, this comes to the kind of reconciliation of like science and religion that we were talking about, or
Mhm.
the lack of conflict, is that if you take this naturalistic stance, it makes sense that people have to find some way of conceiving of things in their human brains of such capacity that enables them to move forward, and some way of conceptualizing things that are just really bigger than our minds are able to conceive. But whether that's the totality of the actual cosmos, which is bigger than we can really wrap our brains around, or if it's these higher level kind of emergent aspects of it that current science captures to a greater or lesser degree, and is sort of the project going forward for the 21st century. Um, we all recognize that there's this, you know, in some cultures they call it the Tao, right?
Hmm.
Why is everything as it is? What's animating everything? Like what enforces the rules of physics? You know, we know what the rules are, but somehow that's being enforced everywhere at all times across the whole cosmos. Like there's something that, and you know, the that's why, and this is again comes to where I talk about the inescapability of some kind of rapturous feeling about it, because then it's
Hmm.
sort of like, even in that naturalistic view, if you're not, if it isn't rapturous to you, you're not all the way there yet, right? Like
Hmm.
anything that is all of that everywhere, you know, across the whole cosmos and includes all of space and time, like something is making that happen and and has led to the emergence of us over
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And speaking of faith, I think there's some sense of faith in like the fact that we have emerged from all of this. Like there's a sense, there's a lot of anxiety to living, right? We're fragile beings in a you know, messy world, that, and we're all going to die, and people used to die horribly more often than not. Um, but like some ability to have faith in the fact that we have arisen in the first place, like some ability to rest, like a deep existential rest in the fact of your existence
Hmm.
and your like ephemeralness, right? Like
Hmm.
that all of this, like we have this sort of like deep need to know or something, or like this deep need to like find some way to survive. And yet this all was going along just fine without us before we got here, you know, and so, like the ability to tap into noticing that the world is moving along just fine,
Hmm.
and maybe you can rest a little bit in some confidence of, you know, that you exist and that this is all going on, um, can be a, you know, something of an antidote to the general
Yeah.
anxiety of living. And
Well,
you could call that faith too, I don't know.
there's a lot of elements in that, and get all these threads that are kind of emerging and converging here. Because as I brought up in our last conversation, I think what largely distinguishes the religious or spiritual sensibility from kind of the standard scientific one, in my mind, is that a religious or spiritual orientation towards existence is one that somehow sees the self in nature, or relates the self to nature in a way that one feels at home in the universe. I think is what Stu Kaufman referred to that as, that there's a sense of a lot of the scientific discourse is presenting a notion of the human as being alien, somehow entirely insignificant, and kind of just a fluke sideshow in this otherwise very, to us, alien cosmos. And it basically says, no, you're the alien because everything is mostly just hydrogen gas, and so you're just, and so there's this profound rupture between our entire lived experience and basically the rest of reality. And I think what religion has always done is bridge that, bound people up into the nature of reality itself. And there's a lot of different ways that happens, but I think this relates directly to this issue of God. So I'll try to weave some points here and get your thoughts on them. But like, for me, one of the big things about this, about the notion of God, is that it is this human, it's an anthropomorphic sort of projection in many ways of like of a personality that is somehow also the cosmos or reality in this kind of cosmic way. And uh and when I listen to you talk about the nature of like the profound mystery and the sublime nature of reality, it sounds very impersonal at the same time as well. And so how so then there's like a lot that comes up there, right? Which is like, on the one hand, I also find kind of simplistic God notions very problematic, because there's a lot of ways that we've come to see that we are essentially just projecting the human onto the world and then relating to ourselves as though it's this objective thing, when science has revealed that there's this whole nature of objective reality that is law-like and mechanistic and even deterministic, but also chaotic and also, complex and emergent. But it does lead to this different conception of the sacred world, which is, as you say, like the Tao, the nature of reality as it is, how it operates, and this sense that we can take peace in sort of the underlying mechanics of the universe as unfolding and something like that. But again, that's a very impersonal way of talking about this. So can you speak a little bit to bridge that a little bit, right? Like w- in that way of looking at the world, where is the human? Because the last thing I'll say about it is that you also touched on the fact that like this is also the same universe that we did spring out of, like this is the cosmos that we came from, and whatever those deep laws and structures of reality are, they led directly to us. And that would be an element that I would critique a lot about how the scientific worldview is often expressed, because that means that we're not these weird aliens. It means that we're somehow intrinsically bound up with the nature of that Tao or that reality. But yeah, speak a little bit about if we are engaging with the ultimate as a kind of more impersonal force that sort of is in the background and that we're sort of, that will go on without us and all that. How do we also see ourselves in it, and how do we relate to it directly?
Yeah. Um, I mean, this gets to a lot of things. This gets to the kind of missing tradition that we talked about last time some, because when I'm talking about science, this again, we need to just distinguish things here. I mean, scientific, I'm talking more about scientific knowledge or just the state of what we know about the cosmos, right? Like the facts of the matter, as well as they are known, and drawing a picture from that. Like we were saying last time, we aren't obligated to, as we don't get to choose our own facts, but we can choose our own interpretations, right? Like, and when I refer to science, I'm not trying to talk about science as an entire worldview, as an entire implicit philosophy. Some of the descriptions you're including here of this kind of dehumanizing or depersonalizing aspect of it, is not the facts. That's the philosophy that gets kind of smuggled along with it, or
Mm,
just um, so the missing tradition that we've talked about is more to being at home in the cosmos, right? More to that like first person perspective, and the nature of consciousness gets into all of this.
hmm
But like we must be at home in the universe because we are born of the cosmos. We are inseparable from it. Like even saying came from it sounds like an act of separation, right?
mm,
Like
mm.
we emerged out of it and now we're this separate thing. Like we're just part of what it's doing. We're a grape on the vine,
We are
and
the cosmos.
we are the cosmos. And honestly, I think a lot of this is going to be misunderstood as long as people, you know, are going to say step one, reach conclusions, right? Like based on whatever notions of things you have currently. It's like if you haven't taken the time to re-understand yourself as unseparate and inseparable from the rest of the cosmos, and really let that sink in, then hold off on conclusion making, or like that is such a radical shift in perspective that until you've gone through that, you're going to reach all the wrong conclusions.
Mm,
Absolutely. Like there's just no way. Like it's so fundamental to how things are. Um, and so part of this sort of missing tradition, and I think something that the ancient Greeks and Stoics did, was to feel very at home in the cosmos, right? Like, and they talked about the logos. The logos was out there, but it was also in here. That was something that we shared in, and like that this sort of very connected sense of your relationship with the rest of the cosmos, and the world and humanity and nature, um, is objectively the case. If you look at the description of the world through science, there are no boundaries anywhere.
mm,
But it's also not in the sort of cultural ethos, kind of worldview of established institutional science, departments to talk that way per se.
mhm,
Like they're not, because it gets a little too preachy if you start
mhm,
talking that way. Um, and they shouldn't. And so like there needs to be this other kind of place and time to say we're not going to quibble on the facts. We're going to take the facts as they come through reliable epistemology, through scientific method, through whatever our best ways of arriving at reliable conclusions is. And then we're going to say, we're going to sit with that, we're going to sit with that for a while and say, what do we make of that? Like, as as grapes on the vine, as part of the total. I'll say organism. I know that'll get problematic, but um, the totality of the thing. You know, it's a valid inquiry to say, as a human being alive right now, faced with this situation of living, being informed of all of this, how do I feel about that? Right?
Hmm.
Like, what is my relationship with the cosmos? What is my relationship with my own existence? How do I. And that's not a thing we do in traditional religions, except to use these sort of like intermediary concepts, these personifications that people may or may not be sophisticated about understanding as personifications versus
Hmm.
something literal and literally true. And it's not something we do in our scientific institutions. We don't.
Yeah.
There is. It's not. We're not encouraged to take it as a call it spiritual, call it deeply personal, call it existential,
Mm.
call it, you know, some sort of pursuit of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wisdom needs a better adjective form, by the way.
Yeah. I'll have to think about that.
Sagacious, ugh.
I had the most
Um,
trouble with trying to adjectivalize integral, which is integrous. And now that I've discovered that, I use it all the time, integrous. But yeah, we need a version of that for
yeah,
wisdom.
sagacious sucks, right? No one knows what the hell
Sagacious. Yeah.
sagacious means,
Yeah, right.
right?
It just
Like,
sounds
but
like
so
you're a
spiritual,
pompous asshole. Yeah, we need a yeah.
yeah.
No, no,
But that sense of connectedness, just to
yeah.
continue a little more, like that sense of connectedness and that sense of inseparableness, is super important. And if we talk about the meaning crisis and all of this sort of cultural like
Hmm.
meaning crisis, like how much of it is just that like
Yeah.
we we don't see the basis for our sense of not being alien in the world, and we beyond that being some sort of special bloom on
Mm.
the
Yeah.
in the garden.
Yeah, yeah,
We are a
yeah.
special bloom in the garden, and like humanity needs to learn to dig itself again, right? Like we're so money and we don't even know it. Like we, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
we are a special bloom in the garden, and I mean
yeah.
that just feeling that way about yourself and humanity and the world goes a long way towards dispelling
Yeah.
existential angst.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a lot there. I wanna move there. Like this, this relates directly to this issue of reclaiming a meta narrative that I want to touch on. But while we're still on the topic of the missing tradition element, I think that that's a great way of really framing all that and contextualizing it because we have the institution of sort of knowledge production in the academy, in the hard sciences that helps drill down on the facts as best as we know them. And we have the institution of religious thought that is largely working off of the inherited traditions from the axial age, essentially. And it's sort of like never the twain shall meet, and both through this sort of schismogenic process are sort of defining themselves in opposition to each other as well, which doesn't help. And so if there were this third thing, this third institution that could kind of, you know, fully grokking the facts that the scientists are producing from their from academe, from the ivory tower, while also being able to integrate the real deep value that is there in the deep traditions of relating self to cosmos and feeling at one with the universe. Then you could get this profound synthesis, and I think that that is what we're driving at. But we shouldn't expect it, I think, is maybe the point from either of these currently institutional frameworks. It's that there's work to be done in trying to carve out this third space. And one thought that came up for me while you were getting at that and while I was moving in that direction is that, there's very much this sort of like um, uh, thought policing that goes on in the institutional context that get established. And for example, I mean, people who are part of academia right now know how big the political correctness and the a lot of the sort of using certain kinds of language is policed, and then ultimately certain kinds of thought is policed, and even saying certain things is just immediately problematic, and you're not allowed to do that. And the kinds of ways that that constricts thought and forces it in directions that honestly most people, if you were to ask them directly and in private would say, yeah, I don't, this is all way too much and it's gone way too far, but we have to play the game, so to speak. A lot of that I feel like does relate in some interesting way to the scientific world, let's say the scientific institution and the worldview that people have maybe been forced to espouse in public context because of the institutional pressures of the discourse of that space, right? It's sort of like it's not just then finding all the facts and whatnot. It's also then having to, whenever pressed, whenever asked, have to link that to a worldview of yes, and this all shows how incredibly small and puny and insignificant human life is, and what a weird cosmic fluke all this is, and the heat death will in the universe, and so everything's transient and meaningless. And it's sort of like, well, wait a second, that needs to be taken out of the universe of facts that have been derived from the sciences, so that the facts are there, but that we can be able to engage them from a different sort of sense making space that can actually say, wait a second, that's not intrinsically bound up in the empirical knowledge that we produced per se, but all these other interpretations are also possible, and that we need that third space to do that. Also, because if you were to try to bring a lot of this stuff into the religious institution, they're going to have their own thought policing going on, and I've experienced that too, where it's sort of like, well, hey, what if we think about this, and what if God is this, and blah blah. No, 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 and so you have these two very encrusted, ossified kind of discourses that really have kind of grown apart radically from each other. Anyway, maybe all this is very evident, but
Well, on all of that is why a lot of the progress is happening. Like if we are in a new axial age, which you might argue we are starting to be, there's
yeah.
the green shoots of something interesting going on here. None of it's coming from academia per se. With a few,
Mm.
there are a few professors who do things on their own time mostly, but like it's not like there is a very interesting, like the groundswell we talked about last time of people in this space, in this, meaning making space, in this sort of this revival of stoicism, this sort of recognition of a kind of a secular Buddhism, like what there is in Buddhism that is actually resonant with reality when you dispense with whatever kind of reincarnation and other kind of metaphysical nonsense that got sort of like glommed on because of cultural context in which it came from. That there is some kernel of like the nature of the mind, the nature of human psychology and such that the a lot of the bulk of Buddhism is basically um a cataloging of is a attempt to wisely define and learn how to work with all of this kind of and the synergies between a secular Buddhism and the Hellenistic philosophies like Stoicism, the sort of the Western flavors, all of this sort of and I think some of the what's going on in the metamodern movement as well in terms of recapturing like a meta narrative and saying, oh, not everything's meaningless here. Hold on,
Mm.
um, like there is a lot of very interesting cultural movement happening, and it's all outside of academia and it's all outside of traditional religions because, yeah, the institutional necessities, the institutional pressures have locked them up into what they have to do to preserve the institutions, and
Yeah.
that is a separate issue from seeking truth wherever you find it.
Yeah.
And people who aren't bound by those institutional prerogatives have the ability to have greater freedom
Yeah.
to pursue things,
Yeah.
and that's where a lot of this progress is happening.
I totally agree, and it's both incredibly. There's a lot of opportunities that arise from that dynamic. There's a lot of challenges as well. I first just want to note that, yeah, I mean, I've also spoken about the idea that this is sort of a new axial age context, like many other people are. And it is very interesting too, because when you go back to the first axial age, something very similar was going on. That you had the ossification of particular political and kind of religious institutions, and the kind of breakthroughs that were happened on the periphery, on the outside of those frameworks, right? They
In the
didn't
open air
just,
market,
yeah,
where
exactly, or
the Stoics
yeah,
gathered on the Stoa, which was a porch. It was a
yeah.
colonnade.
So I think that we're seeing something very similar happening at the moment, and at the same time, it's a challenge for multiple reasons. One, because institutions do provide some meaningful guardrails and kind of, help stay on the track of a certain thing of like, hey, this worked, and so let's keep doing it. And when you're outside that context, things can get a little, the chaos, which is the means by which things can develop, is also the means by which things can break down. All that dynamic comes in. But more, I think, more crucially is the fact that like these institutions have all the resources for being able to do these sorts of things, and so there needs to be a kind of collegial competition, or a kind of productive antagonism between these different movements, I think, because I think they need to speak to each other, right? In terms of like, I know that the kind of work that I'm doing, I need to engage with the academy, but I'm also I find it all the things that happening in that space just very hard to work with at the same time. And so I think we're going to be seeing over the coming years, this really interesting set of allegiances and marriages and convergences in and outside the academy happening, just in observation. But I also, gosh, well, so, oh, and the last thing I wanted to maybe get at there, though, is that there's also then this need to appreciate that while institutions do this thing that we're naming, is they ossify, they get encrusted, and they get stuck, they serve a function. And as much as we are sort of striving outside of the context of institutional knowledge and wisdom, or knowledge, let's say, because there isn't institutional wisdom, and trying to create institutions of wisdom, um, that's the thing. We need to create new institutional contexts in which these things can take root. And it very much is a sort of organic process of, if you watch, like these the tender shoots growing out of a tree that are very supple and pliant at first and green and vibrant, and then they kind of harden. And then, but then the next shoot further up from that is able to do the same thing, and so on. And so I think that we need to be thinking about this, the relationship to institutional context in a dynamic way that appreciates the fact that we also need these new structures to be able to do the sorts of things that these older structures were doing. And before we move on to the kind of meta narrative question, because I have a lot of thoughts on that, what are your thoughts about what does that look like right now? Because you're engaged in some of that work, but there's a lot of work to be done. I'm engaged in it too. I just started an institute, but what does the institutionalization of the missing tradition look like?
I think about that a lot. I mean, it's early days for one, obviously. Like a lot of this is just, bootstrap Zoom calls and um and various like it feels very sort of Tower of Babel at the moment, that there
Mm,
are 10,000 worthwhile little organizations, kind of like each with 20 members and doing their own little retreats, and everyone thinks that they're inventing something new, and they're all doing very much the same thing. So I don't know, like, so there is the project in front of us, and I think about it a lot. I have some notions about the ways in which we want to um, get out of a Tower of Babel situation without, trying to recreate the Catholic Church. We
hmm
also don't want to like homogenize and institutionalize and top down the whole thing. Like right now, it is a very uh, just dynamic and beautiful, sort of like organic, bottom up kind of movement. And you don't want to squash that and create too much rigidity too soon. Like you don't want to,
Yeah.
you don't want the early shoots to get, turn into woody stems too quickly. So, and yet some kind of coming together, some kind of federation, some kind of umbrella, like let's recognize the ways in which we are similar without being too constraining on that, while encouraging and allowing for differences, and like um a diversity of kind of an ecology, right, of inquiries, of organizations, of like that kind of productive, that sort of fecund sort of
hmm
uh diversity is great. But the everyone starting from scratch and
hmm
reinventing the wheel, like you're just wasting so much time on people just covering the same ground over and over again. like
Yeah.
like like there needs to be some efficiency of um not starting over every time.
Yeah.
Like there's a reason why divide and conquer is a thing, right? Like
Yeah.
if we're so divided into little atomized groups, then for one, everyone feels like there's some tiny minority when it's a lot more people than that.
Yeah.
But also it's just kind of wasteful. And
Well,
Yeah, and
I have two quick thoughts. So I totally agree. There's the efficiency element. There's sort of like so two things came up. One is sort of resources and sort of like a manual. There's sort of like I imagine, right? Like uh just as sort of the Catholic Church does have this sort of catechism where people kind of get up to speed on what is it that we're doing here. And they also, I think more importantly, have a kind of well, essentially a redistribution of wealth mechanism that everyone pours into the pot, and then that kind of gets distributed as needed to different parts of the community and different outgrowths of it naturally. It seems that some a positing and offering of something that could be valuable then in this space is one a self-realization of this networked relationship that we are essentially all kind of doing something very similar, and then the willing appreciation to come under some very loosely Confederate umbrella that sort of names the very broad contours of the project and sort of identifies the shared basic impetus while also allowing all that diversity to continue to exist. And then to provide in as broad a way as possible just some of the structural onboarding material that goes into this whole endeavor, right? And something that could work in a Pittsburgh Stoa as well as a Metamodern monastery as well, you know what I mean? In all these different contexts that would sort of be like, hey, this exists if you want to use it, but like here's kind of the basic gist of some of this stuff. So some shared material in that sense. Again, not dogmatic or prescriptive in any profound sense, but just sort of a it's there for part of the structuration of the whole thing. But then two, like contribution, like like right now there are a number of metamodern communities that I support on Patreon, like Metamodern and Integral Stage, I think I still support, and a number of others, right? And it's just sort of like $5 a month kind of a thing. What if there were like kind of like, you know, kind of basically like a funneling of all those resources from all these different communities into some kind of a kind of shared structure that then could be like, hey, we've got $50,000 and there's this small group of people wanting to start a stoa over here, and you know what I mean, and then you could start to
mhm,
see some kind of structural cohesion come together and from shared support and kind of collective action.
yeah.
I don't know, what do you think of that?
I mean, I think that's something that is in front of us to figure out. Like, there's a lot there to be savvy about in terms of the sociology and the institutional dynamics, and to not fall back into a case
Right.
where once money is concentrated in a few people's hands, like they are going to have their conditions on which they're going to give it, and blah blah blah. Blah.
Yeah.
So, like, that's not where my expertise is. And just to say that, that needs to be looked at and figured out. And insofar as you can set things up in such a way as to kind of gird against the anti patterns that you don't want to fall into of just too much institutional rigidity, or whatever, then that's what we need to figure out, right? I don't know exactly. I mean, I think these sort of umbrella organizations do feel necessary. I actually just joined the board of the Stoic Fellowship, which is an organization I was voted on, got lucky enough to,
Cool.
and it is an organization that I think is, taking some steps in the right direction towards what we're talking about. Um, it is a website. It's resources for people who are starting these local groups. They have like a directory of the groups around the world. It's global. They started up like a private social network with different spaces for each of these groups that they can use, and it's just a way of like, sharing the resources, trying to do a little bit of fundraising to create, I don't know, courses or whatever, something to be a leveraging kind of uh, resource for these individual groups without being overly prescriptive and telling them exactly
Hmm.
what to do or anything. Um, but it's a step in the right direction, and I will be very interested to see how that organization grows, and what it could become. But that's specific to the kind of stoicism world. Ultimately, you'd want something that is broader than that, and I think that, broadening it to, and I'm not speaking for the Stoic Fellowship specifically here, but that as these sort of like these sort of umbrella groups, like if there could be something that um, is broad enough without being too broad, right?
Yeah.
Like it can't include everything, or else it's not anything in
Yeah.
particular. But that's the line to walk.
Yeah. Well, and that does get into the content element of it as well, which I think is a good segue into the meta narrative part. But the last thing I wanted to say on that, on that notion was that, we also, apart from not wanting to reinvent the wheel, we don't want to reinvent um the Inquisition. We don't want to just redo all of the missteps from the past, which means we both have to learn from what has worked, but we also need to be able to see that we are in a different space with new tools and new needs at the current moment, and to be able to leverage those appropriately. So it's also possible that, thinking in terms of that whole model that I just laid out, that could be an old model. It could be the one that doesn't work, that will inevitably lead to certain kinds of, dogma and oppression and certain known forms of institutional ossification and all that stuff. And so one element then is sort of like, well, a different tack to take would be, how do we leverage the already existing momentum and what works in our current sort of decentralized digital world with this, and sort of amplify that? Because I think that, I mean, a huge part about all of this, I think, is the advent of digital technologies and communication of, connect the connectome that we've kind of realized over the past 20 years, that's really allowed this thing to blossom, obviously is core, I think, to the whole endeavor. And that operates according to a different logic than the older kind of hierarchical structures. So, we should be, I think, as much as possible, trying to think in those terms, and use the existing medium that's literally coming online, rather than. But we need to do both as well. And so, right, part of also appreciating, the what's come of use from the past, is to be able to take what does work, but to do it consciously and intentionally. So anyway, that's a huge task, and part of sort of the meta onboarding, manuals that would be needed in terms of, like, what are the meta pitfalls to be aware of in trying to structure this sort of project.
Yeah,
But
totally.
the idea of, like, the this being a thing and not just anything, I think, is important, and it does relate to, I think, the kind of content aspect of this, which then becomes difficult but also crucial, because, as you say, like, this this isn't, as long as something is so broad as to be anything, then it isn't anything. And so when we are talking about kind of what this missing tradition is orienting us towards, and what kind of tradition it's working in, a lot of it is what we've been talking about, of sort of like trying to bridge the individual back to a relationship with reality in a way that feels, one of deep connection and in unity ultimately. And I wanted to throw this by you and what you made of this, which is, we were talking a minute ago um, about this idea that we are the cosmos essentially, and that there is that oneness there, and trying to bridge that connection, um, in a way that sometimes scientists actually have been good at, I think, describing a little bit. And I keep coming back to Carl Sagan, who said, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself, which is an idea that has been kind of amplified in all sorts of ways, both in the scientific community and in its own ways in the New Age community. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that, as sort of a general orienting, if not meta narrative, at least just a initial structure of how we might understand, you know, the context of these ideas. That's, maybe that sounds too loose, but I mean, what would you make of sort of framing this missing tradition in a loose idea, that something like that we are part of a cosmos that is experiencing itself, and is sort of, that therefore renders us sort of deeply entwined and enmeshed and entangled and one with the whole process, in a way that I think seems to be comfortable for scientists and spiritual people to talk about. What do you think?
Well, I think that comes out of this missing tradition being, as its sort of prime directive, oriented back toward the first person point of view experience, and the way that religion has always been addressed, right? That, like, it's speaking to the fact that you are in the position of living the life you're living. Like, there is this, there is something that is like, that it is like to be you, and that you are living this, the status of consciousness comes up here. um and I'm getting to what you were saying, to, so if you combine that first person project the task of living from your own point of view and taking that seriously and not as some sort of like epiphenomenon or whatever, right? Like that it is what it is, like it has a reality to you that is unmistakable and undeniable. And that's the position that you're in. And that's ultimately what this project is about. It's not about accumulating objective knowledge. It's not about building some third person view of the cosmos, the view from nowhere. It's about the view from somewhere you are, right? Um, but saying that there are various ways you can go about living that project or living the task of living, doing that project. Um, this particular flavor of it, I mean, there is the full on. There are cults. You can just sort of submit yourself to some daddy figure and just give up all agency and whatever. You can make
Yeah.
that choice if you wanted to. Um, you can adopt an entire kind of fantasy theology that is just this beautiful, angels and whatever kind of view of things that you take very literally. Um, but this particular institution or this kind of wrong word tradition would be would take as its founding principles like wanting to avoid deception or delusion and wanting to avoid futility, right? And avoiding deception, delusion, that sort of thing means that you have to be humble in the face of evidence and reality. And and it turns out that if you are humble in the face of reality, and if you just look at how things are and take this survey of what the cosmos constitutes, um, you are the how part like that is what you part of what you are is the universe, the cosmos coming to know itself and all that, right? So it's not like that is some founding principle per se.
Mm.
That's just what you find when you look at the thing. Like is that is the part of it that you are. Um, and that's cool. Is that enough to give life meaning? Maybe. Like that can also feel kind of pointless, maybe. But you know, on some level, you have to value a thing for itself, or else it also gets into an infinite regress sort of situation where, like, if you ask what's the point of the cosmos getting to know itself? It's like, well, if
Mm.
you don't find that beautiful and worthwhile in itself, well, for one, I would argue you're not really appreciating what you're looking at here. Like
Mm.
you're I don't think you can really fully grok that and not be kind of like rapturously floored by it, right? Like it is sublimely beautiful in a way it's hard to really argue against, right? Like you're like, oh, you're just letting the concepts pass by and not letting yourself be moved by it if you're not
Mm.
moved. Um, but that so
Well,
that
well,
project.
can I say something real quick? Because
Yeah.
that that's a great point, and uh, that infinite regress of skepticism and doubt is a really important thing to be aware of in all this, because you can't ask, well, what's the meaning of meaning, and I find that actually is something that needs to be addressed in all of this. There's many layers to this, but one thing that I think is really important in my evolution of my thinking about this is that there is actually a kind of intrinsic layer at which this stuff bottoms out, which is if you don't embrace a meaningful, well, I'm trying to think about how exactly to language this. I guess I'll put it that way, but I'll qualify it. If you don't embrace a meaningful orientation towards existence, let's say, and you live in a perpetual state of or nah, or but what if and all this stuff, and you will find your lived first person sense of reality increasingly sapped of the kind of motivational orientation towards your own existence. Your own conditions of being become gray and desiccated, and you wind up in this sort of reciprocal narrowing down into this sort of downward spiral of ultimately not caring to be, and therefore ultimately for a lot of people tragically not being, because of suicide and because of just this sort of closing to the world that leads to the non-existence of the organism in question, which is why I've come to really appreciate the way that meaning itself is sort of a almost a tautologically necessary self-justifying aspect, right? Like if a thing is to be, if it's going to keep being, and then it needs to find its being meaningful. And then this is where wisdom starts to enter in, because it's like, well, what is delusion, and what is value in this sort of thing, right? And if you come up with the wrong answers to those questions, you'll know they're wrong, because you will lead to your own life force, your own energy, your own motivation being sapped, and your own world enclosure becoming smaller and smaller. And so I find that meaningful impulse, the will to meaning, as being that thing which opens you up, which, is driving your own transcendence, and it's leading you to increasingly broader conceptions of the majesty and sublimity and beauty of the world. And so I just wanted to throw that out, because I find that there's a kind of logic to that, that I think is important to realize about this approach to meaning making in the world.
And that's
I
why it's
Yeah.
so important to take time to deepen your appreciation of things. I mean, because there's a question of like, how well are you seeing what's right in front of you all the time, right? Like how much of it are you seeing? Like how clearly are you seeing it? How much are you really and truly appreciating what's in front of you? And appreciating can sound like a milk toast kind of a concept, but it's fucking not, right? Like it's I joke sometimes that like appreciation is the most underappreciated concept. Like
Mhm.
it runs deep, right? Like the sublimity of what's in front of you at all times, not just when you're at some special place or on a cliff overlooking an ocean. Like at all times, what's in front of you is sublime and amazing, and you are usually not at all impressed by that, right? You're usually just kind of like, the my desk is a mess because it is,
Mm.
or whatever, like you're usually what your mind is fixating on some certain more or less trivial like aspects of what's in front of you at all times. So again, this comes to like the step one, jump to conclusions. Like with if you haven't taken any time to like really deepen your appreciation of things, to really like polish the lens and clear off the clutter so that you're really feeling and moved by the beauty in front of you all the time, and just dropping your you know instrumental utilitarian like perspective on things, like what is this for me, and like this normal mode that you're in of using it just to navigate your particular needs. And I'm a little hungry today and I need some crackers, like if you're not taking any time to drop that normal mode, to really with deep humility and deep awe and deep appreciation see what's in front of you, then talking about meaning, talking about is life worthwhile is way premature. You don't even
Mm.
know what the fuck you're talking about. You don't even know what world you're referring to, because what your sense of the world, what's in your mind, what you think you're talking about, isn't it?
Mm.
You're talking about some little sliver slice, mind distorted funhouse mirror lens version of the whole thing. And so drawing conclusions based on that is a little premature.
Yeah. I In the past, as I started thinking more about how could I develop a kind of language for a sort of catechism, or a sort of ecology of practices, and what would I include in that? I think I even include this in the emergentism book. I'm not sure, but somewhere between meditation and contemplation, I have this practice I think of as just sort of consideration, which is a word that captures a lot, actually, etymologically, because to consider means to be with the stars, which I find a beautiful etymology. But what I mean by it is just it's the willful act of appreciation, of just like of
Mm,
opening yourself up and just considering reality, just being considerate of what exists, and then taking that into your consideration, being conscious and cognitive of it. But it also then extends into the moral sphere too, because when we relate to each other interpersonally, if I am not being considerate, I am not appreciating you. I'm not taking the fullness of you into account. So there's an ethical component to this as well.
yeah.
And
The
yeah,
opening up to what's around you is a big part of it, right? Like
yeah.
really opening up, really dropping neuroticism is seeing only yourself, right?
Mm,
And like insofar as you have to get past yourself, you have to drop your own narrative that fills up all of your mental bandwidth all the time. Like if you can really shut your mind up and just witness what's around you, and with deep humility, like opening up to that consideration, opening up to letting the beauty come in, letting that fuller sense of things come in. Like if and this takes time. You have to spend time with that, right? Like it's a bending of the stick. You got to kind of keep bending the stick to get it to bend over time, right? Like this is part of why we talk about practices. It's sort of like you have to your the way that brains work, what you repeatedly do will is what you will become, right? Like you just wear grooves in the neural pathways and the neurons that fire together wire together and all of this. Like if you spend all of your time fixating your attention on just your narrow concerns, you will come to feel like that's how the world is.
Mm,
But no, that's just how your mind is, right? And
mhm.
so if you to take in a bigger swath of the world, you've got to open your mind up to more of it and really let it come in. The moments that people talk about being super meaningful, what are those moments? It's when they drop their self concern and suddenly the world just comes rushing in and they just start weeping watching a family walk down the street because it's just beautiful
Mm,
and they just see it. It's
yeah.
just there. That's just what reality is doing right there in a with non-conceptual just and like if you're never having any of those moments, you need to spend some time on that, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that can be, different topic, but I think a lot of people who will hear things like that will immediately recognize that experience from psychedelic experiences. If you're on LSD or something and you look at a leaf
Yeah.
and you're just like all of a sudden your conceptual framework that you've been conditioned to orient to this object is kind of away, and now you're just sort of engaging it in its sort of primal
For better or for
nature or
worse,
something.
that just melts away and gets
Yeah,
shattered.
right.
And you're left without it. So then you have to, yeah.
And of course, then that needs to be integrated and all this other stuff. But I think, but what's interesting about all this for me, and I find all this stuff it begins to converge towards this really beautiful conception of reality that is narratological in some ways, but it's also deeply embodied in practice and just non-conceptual, which is that. So without getting too into the weeds about all this, I mean, the way that I understand this idea that we are the cosmos coming to know itself is that we are the cosmos learning about itself, that everything that we witness is part of an ongoing learning process. And when you think about it from that standpoint, it's a way of looking at reality in terms of being always open to it. Because when we those moments of awe and receptivity to reality in a way unfiltered through our pre-given schema, that's an act of learning. That's being that's that awe feeling. That's that sense of yeah, being open to the newness of reality in a way that we weren't before. And it's interesting too because when you look at, say, the free energy principle or Carl Friston's work around active inference and stuff, and how the mind, how cognition is sort of always operating. It's interesting because our mind is always trying to get us to not be surprised, right? That is like we are being quote unquote successful if our mental model of reality perfectly maps to our expectations, and then no surprise happens. And yet it's interesting because surprise is what characterizes learning. It's all of a sudden it's that thing that you weren't expecting. It's that thing that, you do the experiment and you get weird results, or it's that thing where you learn something new about someone that you weren't expecting, etc. It opens us in a way. And then that is the moment of, and wow, and interesting, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that also should kind of be part of a practice, but it also informs what's going on in the world. Is that we are learning and we are part of this learning process that is also bigger than us, that is also in a sense, and this is Bobby Azarian's point in his book, The Romance of Reality, all of the process of natural evolution is a learning process. And I find that to be, well, framed in that way, right? You can then also bring that all the way back down into the deep traditions from philosophy of know thyself, and to appreciate the importance of philosophy itself as the love of wisdom, because it's an act of getting to understand the nature of the self and the world better in relationship in a way that reciprocally opens. So yeah.
Yeah. And seen that way, humanity is this just stunningly beautiful thing. And how differently would you go about your day if you could just feel deep in your bones that humanity is this beautiful thing. It needs to be nurtured and cultivated and preserved and allowed to flourish and allowed to continue to unfold in whatever way it's going to over the next couple thousand, 10,000, 100,000 years. Like, where is this all going? We don't know. We can't know. In the same way, if you looked back, a billion years and saw pond scum on, you wouldn't think that would become all of this, right? Like we just have to keep the project going and appreciate that it is a beautiful part of the unfolding of the cosmos. Um, it's the whole that the idea that we're some sort of an accident is such a so everything that we are must be allowable within the rules of physics, right?
Hmm.
The cosmos operates in such a way that we will actually can and inevitably will emerge, right? So an accident perhaps in the sense that everything is moving forward in some mechanistic sort of way, like gravity is moving the asteroids around and whatever. um but not an accident in that not all things were possible. Not, and it could very well be that the rules of the cosmos were such that hydrocarbon chains wouldn't grow this long ever, and none of
Hmm.
this would ever happen, right? So it's sort of baked into the rules of things. And I know you and I can debate this, whether these rules evolve over time or not is a question, but um, whether they have always been this way or they've just become this way, you know, it's written into sort of like the fabric of things that we are part of what the universe will do given enough time and space.
Yeah.
And those rules exist within where we are, but those rules also exist over there on the where the matter is on the hill over there.
Hmm.
Like even though that isn't doing this currently, it too is part of that same.
Yeah.
It has the same nature such that we are possible in this
Yeah.
world. So that all sounds very abstract and very out there and woo, but it gets to your own sense of your place. Talking about like being at home in the cosmos, right? Like this groundedness of feeling like you are not some, you know, meaningless accident that, that you are, that we are collectively this important part of the cosmos in terms of a unique phenomenon. Well, unique, unusual is a better word. Um, and really internalizing that and going about your days feeling that, and like there's a joy in that. There's
Yeah.
a real joy in that, like there's a real um when people like wring their hands over like, oh, what's the meaning of everything? It's sort of like it's like, hey, have you looked around?
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I mean, for me, again, and all this is deeply connected, but like, um, reframing significance through the lens of complexity instead of preponderance
Mm-hmm.
is where this really comes from, right? Because
Yeah.
I think a lot of that, default scientist worldview that we were talking about earlier just comes from the notion of, well, whatever is the preponderance of stuff, that is somehow like the that's what matters, so to speak, right? And
Yeah.
because, there's just this one thing that we know about happening in space on this particular planet where life arose and all that. And, of
Yeah.
course, even the scientists are coming around very much in a huge way, even just in the last like 25 years, to the idea that actually life isn't, rare. It's actually probably
Mm-hmm.
just the opposite. Um, but to appreciate that, like, we are the most complex things that we know about, and that complexity does also arise because of the evolutionary process by which we are able to learn more and more, and that our unique complexity is a product of, and is, what would you say, what allows us to be better learners than pretty much than anything that we know of in the universe, right? That we are the most open to being open to reality, both in terms of our autonomy, but also in terms of the way that our minds work to be able to process information, which is what provides us this incredible power to do the things that we're doing. Some of which is really, a lot of which is really, really terrible, and that we need to be cognizant of that and leverage our reason and will to actually then be able to appropriately and sustainably and responsibly steer the mechanisms of our own intelligence, which I think is the big existential issue facing humanity at the present moment. But again, different topic. But yeah, there's just this interesting way of sort of like, you know rather than seeing ourselves, as scientists do, of just like, oh, well, this is just the, 99th percentile. Like, what does that matter? Look at the whole rest of the bell curve and sort of, it's like, well, wait a second, that's a kind of weird way of framing the facts. And
Yeah, there's such an I totally agree, and there's such an obvious sort of rebuttal to that idea that, like you say, significance instead of preponderance, that the cosmic insignificance therapy. On the idea that the the spatial size of a thing is the measure of its importance. Is I don't even know why you would think that. Like, you know, if you were in the Sahara Desert and you were hungry, the the loaf of bread in the middle of the desert is the most significant thing there,
Hmm.
right? Like it's it's the intrinsic quality of the thing,
Hmm.
not its spatial extent that it should matter. Like so, this whole like, oh, there's billions and billions of galaxies, and we're just one in this little tiny speck. Yeah, but that speck is the most interesting part we know of. Like I don't
Yeah.
like.
Well, also even the very
There's a
notion
very
of
easy rebuttal
value.
to that argument.
Right. The very
Hmm?
notion of value is that, right? Like we don't say, oh, this
Yeah,
is the most expensive thing because it's everywhere. It's precisely the opposite. But
right.
I want to bring this back down, well, and begin to kind of close the conversation too, with uh, two related last thoughts, which might also kind of loop us back into the beginning here, because part of part of the part of this, the way that we're talking does begin to bring up ideas that are also still uncomfortable in the scientific institution, very comfortable in the religious institution. But again, I feel like there's a place for this third space, which relates to the idea of sort of teleology. And I wanted to get your
Mhm.
thoughts on that idea, right? Like if there is, as it seems to be, like if we are an undeniable, because of the fact that we're here, manifestation of the very way that the universe works and can work and did work and is working, um, and if we see that as sort of a latent potential in all that other stuff that is happening in the hydrogen gas, that, in enough time in the right conditions, blah, 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 blah. Um, you know, what do we make of that idea? Like, do we situate ourselves then along some kind of vast cosmic continuum that, while yes, we can't presume to predict where it's going in many ways, just as you couldn't look at the pond scum and say, oh yeah, that'll lead to, advanced civilization in however many billions of years, at least can appreciate the broad directionality of the trajectory, right? Like, and if so, one, what is that trajectory? How would you talk about it? And then the last question, which again brings us back all the way to the beginning, is if there is also, as we're both admitting to, this kind of profound um, structure of reality such that it leads to this stuff that we are, which is amazing and is sustaining everything else simultaneously and might be heading to something even more sublime and amazing. What do we make of that source code, right? What is that logos and where does it come from? And do we have to wind up evoking some notion of quote unquote a god or some programmer or some intelligence that would lead to all this intelligencing in the universe? So yeah, the
Yeah.
Telos question first, and then I always like, it's a Dantean sort of structuration, I suppose, but you gotta end in the hierarchical conclusion towards the Godhead in the conversation too. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, just a little succinct point to end on there. Oh yeah, teleology and God. Well, um, yeah, this is where my kind of like preference towards agnosticism comes in a bit. Like, I find some inspiration and some inner, like some illumination from the sense that things have, if you just step back and look at the big history of things, that they have progressed in this way. The life did emerge, that, intelligence has emerged, that consciousness has emerged. Um, I find that to be, you know, it tells you the sort of thing that it is, right? The cosmos. It tells you what kind of thing it is, that it does, this is the way this flower blooms, right? And there may be, and not to say it's the only way, probably a shitload, like probably a lot of ways. In the same way we wouldn't have predicted any of this. There's probably things happening somewhere else that we would have never imagined. Um, and that this isn't the final state of life on Earth either, right? Like the continued evolution of whatever we are and whatever other branches of the tree of life that might also produce something of a different sort than just Darwinian battle, the battle for survival. Um, that that is, to me, I feel like it's inspiring to feel like we are at a certain stage in that, on that escalator, or on that stairway up from something simpler to something, not just more complex, but the complexity leads to, it's not just a change in quantity, but of kind,
Mm,
right? Like when you reach a certain level of complexity, like something else seems to emerge from that, and um, that we're not at the top of that ladder yet, and that who knows. It's just like, well, I don't presume to know too much where that would go.
Mm.
There feels to be a directionality, for lack of a better word. It makes a lot of sense that scientists have, um, you know, discouraged the use of that kind of
Hmm.
thinking in doing scientific research, because it's, science proceeds from causes, not by not moving towards goals, and that's fine. But like, not being a researcher, I can look at it and say this thing is moving a certain way. It's progressing a certain way over time, and it stands to reason it will kind of keep going in some further, uh, flourishing of whatever the potential there is. And that's sort of enough for me. That's enough
Hmm.
for me to feel like, okay, this is really cool. No one would have guessed this 2 billion years ago looking at this planet, and let's keep this going and see what else is possible.
Yeah.
And it's all beautiful. It's
Yeah.
all wondrous. And I, you know
Yeah.
what else do you want?
Yeah. I mean, there are kind of at least two ways that I see um, the God element fitting to that in a totally reimagined way, right? I don't mean God in the sense of there's this human and the sky and all that, right? But that the sense of more the philosophical notion of God as first principle, God as, but also the sense in which, again, that we see our own face in the cosmos, to put it poetically, which, you know, recalling Dante, I guess, again, is there's that's his final image at the end of the Paradiso, is that, all the entire stairway, escalator, the entire uh, hierarchy of spheres leads to, the face at the end, in the Empyrean, which I think again is just this profound encapsulation of wanting and needing uh, feeling increasingly justified to see the subject, the conscious being, as a at home in reality, as part of reality,
Mm.
as a meaningful product of and core constituent player in reality. But then also beyond that, because then Dante moves into the face and beyond it, and then he enters the ineffable, in which, he can no longer speak, and therefore the poem ends in sort of this kind of divine, uh, silence. And that to me is another really profound instance of this, is that, like, that mystery that we're talking about, that into which we are heading, into which, or beyond which we can't predict, but that stuff that we are, by just the very passage of time, moving into and having to assimilate and integrate into our consciousness, and therefore learn more about reality, is that capital M mystery that I think of as sort of being equatable to the divine, in certainly the way that maybe the mystical traditions tend to speak about it. And I find that a very compelling synthesis between sort of all this science informed, perspective that we're taking in this sort of third way missing institution, and the kind of contemplative and mystical traditions of religion as well, leading into this sort of ineffable silence of the mystery that we're always sort of folding in and making real. So that's, and then the last thing about that, though, does seem to be that I hold open this agnosticism as well, and I think that that's very important because, well, gosh, one, we definitely don't want to keep doing that thing where this image becomes increasingly ossified and dogmatically reinforced in a way that we have to, always kind of be breaking that image. Um, but at the same time, it is very fascinating because there is this sense of, you know, where if that's the end, so to speak, or if that's sort of the overall encompassing framework of it, is that somehow also the beginning of it, and does that somehow simultaneously answer that mystery about, like, why is the conscious, why is the cosmos so uh set up in this kind of sublime, incredible way? Um, those are just, I don't know. That's where my thought leads to, but I don't have any answers for it, and I think that we should be comfortable not having answers for that, but also I think we should allow for those things to be able to be in the mist and the ether in this sort of space as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we can speculate about those sort of things and sort of like extrapolate and sort of, peer into the mist a little bit and you know, that's part of trying to come to grips with the extent of what we know and what might be beyond what we know and how like what might we reasonably expect extrapolating from what we do know. As long as we know that we're speculating, and I
Yeah.
again just tend to sort of say I too get this sort of like vague sense of like more like and in the direction of consciousness and whatever, but then I just try to stay real about what I
Mm,
like. Okay, that's how it feels to me. That's how it seems. I that's how I expect the unknown to be, but it's the unknown to me still,
yeah.
and I don't pretend to know more than I do.
Yeah.
And but one move, and we didn't really get into this too much this time, which maybe we can another time, is one move that I personally make beyond just sort of like just the facts, ma'am, of
Hmm.
scientific knowledge and all of that, is after many years of consideration and reading lots of people's take on informed people's take on this question, I've become pretty well convinced that consciousness is some kind of constituent of the cosmos in itself as it seems to us. And
Mm,
I don't know how the hell that works. I don't know how that interfaces with the physics and other natural sciences that we know, but
hmm.
the idea that you could ever reduce it to explanation in terms of neurons and everything in a way that would be fully satisfying. Um, I've after this is not a decision I leapt too quickly, but as I've to me it doesn't seem like my chips are on that board that
Hmm.
space on the board that and I know this is a little bit of speculation. I know I might ultimately be wrong about that, but I feel like I'm on pretty solid ground to say so. Um, if that's right, that creates all kinds of different um, possibilities in terms of like, well, all right, so if consciousness is in some in irreducible sense a part of the cosmos, then what else, right? Like the kinds of things you're talking about. Like,
Mm,
well, this is the beginning. Like as these social primates become more and more advanced to a certain degree, and our brains develop to a certain degree, and our minds start to like have this greater sense of consciousness, which insofar as we have generalized intelligence and this consciousness that we are surpassing the constraints and the guidance of our own evolutionary history, right? Like we are
mm,
into a different space, um, like which is part of what creates the need for any kind of wisdom tradition to begin with. Like wild animals already know what to do; they don't need
mm,
to have a mental framework for things.
mm,
Um, like insofar as we're starting to emerge into this other, I don't want to say another realm because it's not separate, but like this other mode of existence that the cosmos is apparently capable of, that raises the question of how much further does that go.
mm,
And I don't know. I've had the range of conscious experiences that I've had. Some of them are pretty intriguing, but that's sort of like a intriguing open avenue to me
hmm.
that I won't claim to have gone further down that road than I have, but you have to wonder what else is possible there.
Yeah. Well, and if everything was known, we couldn't learn. So there's something that a wisdom, you could say, in just accepting the goodness of there being mystery and the continued unfolding of things, and always something beyond our ken. But it is interesting to bump up right against the horizon of one's knowledge and to yeah, kind of try to peer into the mist a bit. And I mean, in some ways, that is sort of the ongoing project of could call it the religious quest going back, all the way to ancient human peoples from the shamans, doing various kinds of activities to change their consciousness, to meditation, to, ultimately the kinds of contemplative practices that moved into philosophy and theology that then gave us the natural sciences. And so it is all, so I think, kind of a one that we're engaged in. So as much as, yeah, we shouldn't hang our hat on any speculation as dogma, I think that we shouldn't close those avenues off too, because if we did that, we'd basically be throwing ourselves right back in with that kind of already existing scientific tradition that is just the facts, ma'am, right? But there is something about the third space of this missing tradition that I think should invite us to to continue asking those questions and bumping up against the limits. And of course, also, you know, to be fair to the scientists as well, there's a lot of imagination and questioning and inquiry and openness that goes into genuine scientific endeavor too. So that's there as
Of course.
well. But anyway, well, let's leave it there. But this was an absolutely fascinating conversation. I really appreciate this, and yeah, we'll pick this up again some other time. Any final thoughts or
Oh, there's so much more. We'll have to um but it's just yeah, it's all very exciting. And I just love the more I dig into all this stuff and just seeing like, coming across people like you who are pulling on these threads and seeing like the 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 birth and evolution of something new here and
mm,
like this sort of I think there's a lot to be said about the idea that or for the idea that there's a bit of a new axial age that we're getting into. Like
mhm,
like there's a need to figure out what spirituality can be in the 21st century for 21st century and beyond.
mm,
We can't just cling to our old theologies and our old, like
mhm,
like if there's some, call it spiritual, call it, inspiring, call it like deeply moving and existential like way of relating to our own existence, to the planet in a way that makes us care about all life and all humanity and all of that. Um, that's the sort of animating framework that we need to
mm,
be a sustainable
yeah.
civilization for another couple thousand years, right? Like if we're all just trying to get the most for ourselves and
Yeah.
doing our current thing, yeah, we're not going to get there. So like,
Yeah.
and you start pulling on these threads and there you don't have to make things up. Like there's a
Mm,
very real reality based uh vision here
yeah.
of a more, yeah, like a spirituality that's based in reality that can carry us into the century and beyond.
That's the whole project. That's the whole vision, and that's the whole endeavor. So, a wonderful interlocutor on the topic, and to be continued for sure. But Patrick Barry, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.